I think it's time I finally approached one of my all-time favorite consoles that Sega ever made. And the last console they ever made, the Dreamcast. This was a great system, and absolutely one of the consoles that always comes to my mind first when you start talking about the all-time great consoles. Now, this was Sega as we knew them in the Genesis days. Not afraid to compete, not playing it safe, and just coming out with title after title and experimenting with new IPs. And boy, did they need to. This system dropped in 1998, roughly 2 years after the Saturn died, at a time where most people thought Sega was, well, done with the hardware business. After the poor support of the 32X due to its release being timed too closely to the Saturn in Japan, on top of the Saturn having the most botched American release of pretty much any console ever in existence, Sega had lost most of its fan base and its consumer confidence, particularly in the United States. This had traditionally been one of their biggest markets since the days of their incredible marketing campaign in the Sega Genesis. One of the most prominent reasons they came out so hard with this console is that according to Bernie Stolar, a prominent figure in the video game industry at the time, Sega had lost $1 billion in the year before he was hired on. Sega had 8 pieces of hardware going concurrently, he said. Sega's management had greatly overextended themselves. He immediately came in and cut most of the people from Sega of America, going from 300 employees down to 90, and began revamping the marketing and sales strategies that they were using. To do this, he started hiring people that he felt were the best and the brightest available, with the sole purpose of regaining the trust that Sega had lost with retailers during its Saturn days. Sega was nearly bankrupt, Stolar said. They needed a new console, and they needed it quick. The only option was to go big or go home. To pull off this Hail Mary that Sega needed, they began working in earnest on the Dreamcast hardware, setting up not one, but 2 teams to work on development of the system, one code-named Black Belt and the other called Katana. Sato would head up the division called Katana, and chose to use Hitachi's SH4 chip along with Videologic's Power VR2 graphics processing unit made by NEC. Interestingly enough, the first revision of the Dreamcast hardware in this one had water cooling. They implemented a non-moving water-based cooling system called Durell that would eventually be scrapped due to cost. Yamato, based in the US, heading up the Black Belt team, chose the IBM Motorola Power PC, but was later asked to swap it to the same model that Sato's team was using in Japan. They also entered into a contract with American-made graphics card developer 3DFX, and wanted to make use of a modified version of their very popular Voodoo 3 graphics card for use in this version of the system. Both of these architectures were good options. The 3DFX chip had a solid set of libraries that would help developers make games more efficiently and more quickly. The Power VR2 chip had an interesting tile-based rendering system. This allowed it to not render polygons that weren't on the screen, that made it less CPU intensive. This allowed it to provide a lot of power at a relatively low cost. However, it was a relatively unknown architecture to most developers at this time. Also around this time, Sega was debating heavily on whether or not to add a modem into the system. Bean Gordon, who was a creative officer at EA at the time, was one of the deciding factors on that front, saying, "You have serious competition here with Sony and Nintendo, so a modem is a really good idea. If you put a modem in it, we'll build a whole product line for it." And that pretty much made the final decision on whether or not to include the modem in the final product. While Sega was trying to finalize which hardware they wanted to go with, 3DFX began building Accolade for its graphics chips and started doing well. Then, in 1997, they went public, announcing its IPO, and in the process, revealed the details of its contract with Sega, which was required by US law. This announcement, however, had an unexpected fallout as it publicly revealed Sega's blueprint for its upcoming system. This obviously angered the executives at Sega of Japan. Numerous reports state that Black Belt was in the lead as the final design for the Dreamcast, but Sega was so upset at 3DFX, they severed their contract with the company entirely and went with the Katana design. 3DFX, on their part, would later sue Sega over it and have the dispute settled out of court. All of this started to make EA very, very nervous. Bill Gordon said they went with some other 3D chip we'd never heard of, and they went with a weird processor. We looked at all this and we asked ourselves, why did they make these choices? It's gotta be some sort of political thing, because these are dumb choices. Even Stoldar, the head of Sega of America, said, I felt the US version, the 3DFX version, should have been used. But Japan wanted the Japanese version, and Japan won. I lost that argument. This is not the only time in Sega's history that somebody from Sega of America has gone to Sega of Japan and lost an argument even though they had good reason. This has been historically a large problem for Sega as a company during their entire tenure of hardware manufacturing. EA was getting increasingly confused with many of the decisions that Sega was making. Gordon remembered a talk with his chief technical officer talking about the processor. His chief technical officer said, "Oh my god, I don't know anybody who has even heard of this chip. It's non-standard and there are no libraries for it." But even then, EA was thinking, you know what, we went to war with Sega on the Genesis and we did great things. So the chipset, not a deal breaker. Ultimately though, Sega's indecision over the chipset, whether to throw in a modem, along with their hardball tactics and negotiations over licensing, would start to throw many red flags for EA. Gordon said there was a push from Sega, which was having cash flow problems. They couldn't afford to give us the same kind of license that EA had over the last 5 years. At this point, EA basically said, you can't succeed without us, to which Sega just replied, of course we can, we're Sega. Stolar, head of Sega of America, remembered things very differently. He came in and he said, man, this is what happened very clearly. Larry, the representative for EA, came in and said, Bernie, we'll support the Dreamcast, but this is what I want. And I thought, great, I know Larry, I know the company real well, I can negotiate this. I thought he was going to ask for smaller royalties, and that would have been fine, I can give him small royalties, no problem about that. This time though, EA was really well known for hitting up console developers early in their life cycle, usually before launch. They would use this to their advantage to get better deals while these companies were worried things about like launch titles, hardware specs, and unit allocation. They would come in and strike a 5-year deal to get the best licensing deal they could, but this time EA wanted more. Larry Probust would go on to say, we want to be the only sports brand on the Dreamcast. We want exclusive rights to be the only sports brand on Dreamcast. This kind of surprised Stolar because he'd just spent $10 million on acquiring Visual Concepts to make games for them under the Sega Sports brand. So he responded, sure Larry, tell you what, as a third party I'll agree to that, but I'm not going to agree to that for first party. I just bought Visual Concepts for $10 million, so you can compete with Visual Concepts, we'll have Visual Concepts sports titles, and we'll have EA sports titles. That'll be it. They responded, no, I don't even want to compete with Visual Concepts. Stolar replied, okay, forget it then, end of story. That's what it was all about right there, he said. Sega would eventually go back to EA to try to ease tensions and make a deal, but EA would not budge in the slightest. This would be the first time that Sega would launch without EA titles since the Genesis. Sega decided to launch again, first in Japan, a notoriously bad market for them traditionally, and much to no one's surprise fell short. Due this time primarily to manufacturing shortfalls, making the system in short supply, and a delay in what was their first killer app, Sonic Adventure. They also suffered from a lack of launch games available on the day the console debuted. This caused their stock to go down to what was effectively one notch above junk status. Adding insult to injury, EA announced they would officially not be making games for the Dreamcast. This hurt Sega quite a bit, as they had always marketed themselves as one of the consoles with the most ports and the best sports titles. Now without titles like Madden to show on their console, they were even more on the back foot. Sega, however, wasn't about to give up. They wanted to make a big impact in America, promising to spend $100 million on the US introduction, double what Sony did with the PlayStation at its launch. On top of that, they were going to drop another $100 million on product development, with additional funds to defray the cost of some of the cost of creating games for outside developers. Stolar, for his part, went on to hire Peter Moore, who began spending his first week getting used to his new role and coming up with an idea of how to market the Dreamcast, eventually coming up with this idea, It's Thinking, which started a series of 15-second ads for the system. The idea was to try to catapult gamers into thinking that this was going to be a new level of artificial intelligence, a new level of hardware power, able to play games unlike anything else seen in the market. On top of this, they started to work all the angles for the American launch, teaming up with retailers to make sure that consumers could pre-order the console, guaranteeing that you would have it on the day that it launched. The marketing was working. Babbage's reported passing the 100,000 mark in Dreamcast pre-orders. Date Yamato, Babbage's CEO, had this to say, We're expecting the biggest single day in our chain's history on September 9th, and I want to open early to accommodate the many gamers who can't sleep until they own a Dreamcast. Finally, the Dreamcast launched in the US at a very attractive price of $199 and had 18 launch titles, including Sonic Adventure, Power Stone, Hydro Thunder, and Soul Calibur to name a few. It took off in a big way. Just 4 days after the launch, 372,000 hardware units have been sold, tallying $132 million. The first 24 hours sales alone put Sega in the Guinness Book of World Records at the time for the most revenue generated in the entertainment industry in 24 hours. Electronics Boutique stated in a September press release that the Dreamcast, I quote, resulted in the company's largest single day of sales in its 22-year history. The system quickly picked up speed, and in 2000 launched SegaNet, along with a host of games meant to take advantage of the new online connectivity, featuring Bomberman, Fantasy Star Online, Quake 3 Arena, and all of Visual Concepts 2K2 slate of games. People could play online with a console through their phone line. This was unheard of in the console industry at the time. Sadly, this was a short-lived victory, because in September of 2000, just 1 year after the North American launch, Sega was again in trouble. Sony's PlayStation had managed to grab a majority of the console market share, and the PS2 was starting to build a substantial amount of press. It was slowly coming to dawn on Sega of America that Sega just didn't have the pockets to truly market the console against the likes of Nintendo and Sony. There were also rumors that Microsoft, who had partnered with Sega to make its Windows CE operating system work on the Dreamcast, was going to jump into the game market itself. Sega just didn't have enough money from its still thriving arcade market and was strapped for cash. They couldn't pay money to get exclusives, they had no money for advertising, and finally, Sega of America went to Sega of Japan and said, "Staying in the hardware business is not our advice." The next thing that happened was all the heads of all the studios got up and walked out without saying a word. That, in Japanese culture, is pretty rude, but they were shocked. Moore would go on to say that Sega was arguably one of the greatest software companies ever, and it should focus on its major strength, software. The industry was going through a significant transition which created a quandary. Japanese content was becoming less and less relevant to the West. Western developers were growing in stature. What it boiled down to in the end is that the Dreamcast was just up against competition that was far too entrenched and without a budget to properly swing in the growing and maturing gaming market. Sega was coming off a string of heavy losses. With the Saturn and running so many products concurrently, it just left them financially strapped. Too financially strapped to be able to compete effectively and push a console. Couple that with Sony's strong first entry and their second console on the horizon, and they just simply ran out of options. This would be Sega's last console, and the end of the bit wars as well, as shortly after, consoles would drop that as a selling point. To their credit, Sega has been very successful as a publisher and developer, with titles like Bayonetta, Alien Isolation, and even Yakuza under their belt. They continue to prove that they're a force to be reckoned with in the industry, and I for one would like to see Sega try making a console at least one last time. I'd like to take a moment here to thank those of you that stuck with me this long and took time out of your day to watch this video. The Dreamcast was a very special console that I still have incredibly fond memories of, and it was a joy to take this trip down memory lane with you, even if it was a bittersweet ending. I'd also like to ask you for one more favor if you would. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you aren't subscribed, please do so and hit the notification bell so you know when I upload new content. But for now, have a wonderful day, and until next time, happy gaming.